What is Neville Goddard's revision technique, and why does it hold the extraordinary power to reshape the very story of your life? This is where the revelation begins, because in this video you will discover how Neville taught that your past is not a prison, but a painting, still wet with the colors of imagination, waiting for your final brushstroke. This is where it matters, because by the end you'll understand how revising one memory can shift the course of your destiny, and how you can use this power to heal, restore, and recreate everything you thought was lost. This is how the journey unfolds, revealing not only the method Neville used, but also the secret reason it works. The principle that imagination is the creative force of God within you. This is where belief meets evidence, because Neville didn't just speak of hope. He demonstrated transformation through memory itself. This is where the unseen becomes visible, as you'll see how to step beyond regret and replace it with creation. This is where truth breaks through, showing that your life is not a chain of unchangeable events, but a mirror of the assumptions you hold right now. This is why it matters, because once you learn to rewrite what was, you begin to live as who you truly are, the author, not the victim. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that every scene from your past still exists as a state in consciousness that can be entered and transformed at will. This is where the mind reclaims its throne, for imagination rules reality and memory obeys it. This is how freedom begins, when you stop reacting to old pain and start revising it into wisdom. This is the turning point, where you realize that the same creative act that forms a dream can also reform your history. This is where illusion fades, as you learn that time itself is pliable under the influence of assumption. This is where emotion becomes alchemy, transforming sorrow into strength through the act of inner recreation. This is where you learn the language of the subconscious, which responds not to logic, but to vividly felt experiences. This is how it deepens, when you understand that every revision changes not only your feelings, but also your future encounters. This is where the paradox dissolves, and you see that altering your past doesn't erase truth, it reveals a higher one. This is where the ordinary self dies, making room for the awakened creator who knows that nothing is final until it is imagined so. This is where the promise takes form, showing that the power you seek has always been in your awareness itself. And this is where it all begins, because to revise the past is to remember your divinity and to rewrite your life from the inside out. Can you imagine discovering that every memory you hold is not a record of what was, but a living seed capable of being replanted and reborn in the garden of your mind? This is where the unseen magic unfolds. For Neville Goddard taught that memory is not history, it is potential waiting for revision. This is where you begin to see that your past, like soil, holds dormant possibilities that respond to the touch of imagination. This is where it takes root, as you learn that when you revise an event, you are not escaping the past. You are giving it new meaning and new life. This is where energy shifts, because every emotion once attached to pain becomes fertile ground for transformation. This is where the alchemy happens, as feeling is transmuted into faith, and faith becomes form in your outer world. This is where you start to understand that your subconscious mind does not know the difference between what was lived and what is vividly imagined. This is where the story deepens, because when you plant the new image, the universe begins to rearrange itself to match your revised assumption. This is where invisible threads move, aligning people, places, and circumstances with your new emotional state. This is where you realize that revision is not about pretending, it's about reprogramming the feeling of reality within you. This is where you grasp that belief is the soil, imagination the seed, and feeling the water that makes the new story grow. This is how you begin to reclaim power, no longer chained to an event, but liberated by the meaning you give it. This is where awareness blossoms, for you are no longer the passenger of your memories, but the gardener of your destiny. This is where the shift in perception becomes the shift in reality, proving Neville's truth that imagination creates facts. This is where cause and effect merge, for your inner revision becomes the unseen cause that reshapes tomorrow's experiences. This is how it deepens, when you realize that every emotional reaction is an invitation to create anew. This is where you begin to feel gratitude, not for what happened, but for what can now emerge from it. This is where the illusion of permanence dissolves, revealing the fluidity of all experience through the creative power of mind. This is where new timelines open, and you start to live in the story you've chosen, rather than the one you inherited. And this is where it continues, because the moment you revise a memory, you plant the seed of a new world that is already growing within you. Picture for a moment the quiet hour before sleep, when the world softens and the mind drifts between the seen and unseen, for this is the sacred space where Neville Goddard performed his greatest work, revision. This is where the true practice begins, as Neville taught that each night, before surrendering to sleep, you replay the events of your day and gently rewrite them as you wish they had been. This is where you become the director of your inner movie, editing scenes not out of denial, but out of divine authorship. This is where the ordinary becomes mystical, as you lie still, close your eyes, and recreate the conversation that hurt you, transforming it into one of kindness, understanding, and harmony. This is how the process awakens power, for the subconscious mind is most receptive in that drowsy, in-between state when imagination is free of resistance. This is where the dialogue changes, where the words that wounded you are replaced with the ones that heal you until they feel real and alive within your senses. This is where the transformation anchors, because feeling the new scene as real imprints it on the subconscious, which accepts it as fact and begins to manifest accordingly. This is how inner work becomes outer change, as life quietly rearranges to reflect the revised event through coincidences, reconciliations, or unexpected relief. This is where repetition builds mastery, because every night you revise, you are training your consciousness to assume control over memory itself. This is where the mind reconditions itself, moving from habitual reaction to intentional creation. This is where the emotional residue of the day dissolves, leaving your inner world clean, harmonious, and free to dream anew. This is how self-forgiveness takes form, not through words but through loving imagination that redeems every scene of the day. This is where the ego loses its grip, as you realize that you no longer have to defend your past, you can redesign it. This is where the rhythm of creation unfolds, night after night, as imagination and sleep become the tools of transformation. This is where the simplicity of the act hides its immense power, for the smallest revision can redirect the current of destiny itself. This is how Neville lived what he taught, demonstrating that mastery of imagination is mastery of life. This is where consistency becomes revelation, because every practice session deepens your conviction that you are the cause of your experience. This is where time begins to blur, as what you imagined last night begins to unfold as lived truth today. This is where the ritual becomes remembrance, a nightly communion with the creative power within. And this is where you realize that your pillow is not merely a place of rest, it is the altar where your world is rewritten before dawn. Now consider this, the idea that every memory you hold is not a frozen photograph, but a living painting, forever responsive to the brush of imagination and emotion. This is where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself, because Neville Goddard insisted that memory is not history. It is imagination stored and replayed under the illusion of permanence. This is where perception becomes art. For each time you recall an event, you repaint it with the colors of your present mood and belief. This is where reality bends, because what you continually imagine with feeling becomes the new version your subconscious accepts as true. This is how the past becomes pliable, as thought and emotion combine to reshape the texture of what once felt unchangeable. This is where the creative act transcends time, showing that imagination is not trapped in chronology, but governs it entirely. This is where you begin to grasp that every recollection is a creative choice, an interpretation, not an obligation to the facts that once were. This is where truth expands, because you realize that the world outside you is only a mirror reflecting what your inner canvas displays. This is how the artist awakens within, for you are no longer bound to memories as spectators, but as the painter who can restore, brighten, and renew the image. This is where emotional mastery begins, because the feeling you attach to a memory becomes the brushstroke that defines its power over you. This is how healing takes form, as old pain dissolves when repainted with compassion and understanding through imagination. This is where the line between remembering and creating fades, and you see that both spring from the same creative substance. This is where limitation dies, because you realize that to revise memory is to reclaim authorship over the entire narrative of your life. This is how identity evolves. For every new image you paint, rewrites who you are in the present moment. This is where Neville's wisdom shines, reminding you that creation is finished, and revision simply selects another version of reality from the infinite. This is where imagination reclaims dominion, showing that nothing is set in stone except what you continue to feel as true. This is where power hums quietly in awareness, waiting for you to pick up the inner brush and begin anew. This is where the past bows to consciousness, proving that the mind is not a recorder but a projector of meaning. This is how revelation feels, gentle yet irreversible, as you realize you have been creating your memories all along. And this is where the canvas clears, because the moment you choose to repaint what was, the masterpiece of your new life begins to emerge. Suppose you discover that every thought, fused with emotion, leaves a chemical and energetic footprint within your body and subconscious mind, and that Neville Goddard's revision technique directly rewires that imprint. This is where ancient mysticism meets modern science, because neuroscience now confirms what Neville taught decades ago, that the brain cannot distinguish between a vividly imagined event and a lived one. This is where imagination becomes biology, as your neurons fire in the same pattern, whether you are remembering or recreating a moment in your mind. This is how emotional alchemy begins, because every revision literally reshapes the neural pathways that once reinforced your pain or regret. This is where awareness meets transformation, as you realize that memory is not a static recording, but a dynamic, living network, constantly being edited by what you feel now. This is where it becomes revolutionary, because when you reimagine an event with new emotion, you're not erasing truth. You're teaching your nervous system a new story to believe in. This is how subconscious healing happens, quietly and powerfully, as your body relaxes into the feeling of a new reality that feels safer, lighter, and freer. This is where the science of faith unfolds, showing that belief, when felt, becomes the physiological language through which the subconscious understands change. This is how energy transforms matter, as each revised emotion sends new chemical signals of peace instead of stress through your system. This is where the invisible becomes measurable, because your heart rate, breathing, and cellular activity all respond to what you imagine as true. This is how the bridge between mind and body is crossed, revealing that the imagination is not fantasy, it's instruction. This is where you start to comprehend that the feeling of the wish fulfilled is not a poetic phrase, but a biological command to the subconscious to reprogram reality. This is where the deeper miracle lies, because by feeling differently about your past, you begin to live differently in your present. This is where science affirms spirit, proving that consciousness is the architect of the physical experience. This is how empowerment takes form, as you understand that you no longer have to wait for outer change before feeling inner peace. You can feel it now and watch your world align later. This is where habit becomes liberation. For every nightly revision becomes a neurological rewrite toward freedom and wholeness. This is how healing feels, subtle yet undeniable, as the old emotional charge weakens and the new narrative takes root. This is where cause and effect merge within you, because the emotional seed you plant today becomes the outer experience of tomorrow. This is where Neville's wisdom bridges centuries, showing that imagination is the science of creation disguised as faith. And this is where realization dawns, that to revise with feeling is to rewire not only your mind, but the very vibration of your existence. Envision a world where the past isn't a closed chapter, but an open doorway, and where changing your inner memory alters the timeline of your destiny itself. This is where Neville Goddard's most daring claim takes center stage, that the past and future are not separate. They are states of consciousness existing now, waiting for your command. This is where perception bends reality. For the moment you revise how something felt, you also shift what comes next because the cause has changed at its root. This is where the invisible architecture of life reveals itself, as the emotional assumptions you hold about the past quietly sculpt the probabilities of your future. This is how time becomes fluid, responding not to clocks, but to consciousness, which alone determines the sequence of events you call fate. This is where the power of imagination proves its dominion, because every time you change your inner film reel, life begins projecting a different scene on the screen of reality. This is where logic trembles, because the rational mind wants the past to remain factual, while the awakened self knows facts are merely frozen perceptions awaiting revision. This is how the bridge of incidents forms, as new opportunities, reconciliations, or releases unfold that align with your revised inner story. This is where divine order becomes visible, for nothing happens by chance. Everything rearranges to confirm your new assumption of what has always been true. This is where cause and effect dissolve into unity, revealing that your past is not behind you. It's within you, awaiting transformation at any moment. This is how destiny becomes art. When you realize you can retell a painful story and watch your future bloom from compassion instead of fear. This is where karmic chains break, not through effort, but through changed perception that frees all involved from their old roles. This is where forgiveness takes on mystical depth, for by revising an event you are not pretending. It truly never happened that way in the timeline of your new awareness. This is where self-concept transforms, because the you who suffered no longer exists once the memory has been reimagined and emotionally sealed in love. This is how you become timeless, living not as a victim of sequence, but as the chooser of experience, moving effortlessly through the eternal now. This is where mastery begins, as you understand that the past bends to your will when guided by conviction and love, rather than regret and fear. This is where magic becomes method, for revision isn't just spiritual, it's metaphysical technology for shifting realities. This is where your consciousness becomes the true time machine, navigating dimensions through feeling, not motion. This is how Neville's teaching reveals the grand secret, that all time is one, and imagination is the thread that weaves it together. And this is where realization strikes, that changing the past is not rewriting history. It is reclaiming authorship of the eternal story you call your life. Think of the moment when you finally grasp that Neville Goddard's revision technique is not an isolated trick, but a living demonstration of his central principle, the law of assumption. This is where the invisible mechanics of creation come alive, because to revise is to assume that the event you wished for actually happened as you desired it to. This is where imagination fuses with conviction, as the feeling of "it is done" replaces the longing of "I wish it were so." This is how the technique transcends fantasy, for assumption, once emotionally accepted, becomes the creative law that commands the subconscious to manifest it into form. This is where the mind's theater becomes divine, because your assumption of a new past automatically births a new chain of future outcomes that align perfectly with that belief. This is where energy rearranges, because the law of assumption operates not by chance but by vibrational certainty. Whatever you persist in feeling as true must externalize in your world. This is where you realize that every revision is a declaration of faith, an inner knowing that the new version of the story is already real within consciousness. This is how spiritual authority replaces passive hoping, as you stop wishing and start assuming that all has already been fulfilled. This is where the bridge of incidents quietly forms, constructing invisible pathways that bring your inner revision to visible reality through natural, believable means. This is where the creative act stabilizes, for once you feel your assumption deeply enough, no outer contradiction can unsettle it. This is how imagination becomes law, because the subconscious never argues. It simply obeys the state you occupy most consistently. This is where the process becomes effortless, as assumption turns repetition into embodiment, and embodiment into manifestation. This is where the difference between thinking of and thinking from becomes your compass. One keeps the desire distant, the other lives it now. This is where you see Neville's genius. He taught not to fight appearances, but to persist in the invisible until the visible conforms. This is how your world begins to mirror your inner conviction, bending itself around your sustained assumption like light refracting through glass. This is where every thought gains consequence. Every feeling becomes a seed, and every revision becomes an act of divine authorship. This is how you start living as cause, understanding that assumption precedes creation as surely as sunrise follows night. This is where the ordinary human becomes the conscious creator, shaping destiny through inner certainty instead of outer struggle. This is how miracles lose their mystery, because what once seemed supernatural is revealed as natural law in motion. And this is where it all clicks. Revision is the law of assumption in practice. Proof that what you dare to assume as true must one day stand before you as fact. Ask yourself what happens when a man not only teaches divine imagination, but dares to live by it in every moment. For that man was Neville Goddard. This is where teaching becomes testimony, because Neville's life was not theory. It was the evidence of imagination made flesh. This is where the myth becomes real, as he demonstrated the revision technique in stories that defied logic yet proved the law. This is where his words turned to living examples, such as when he revised a letter of rejection into one of acceptance and watched it arrive just as he imagined. This is where faith meets proof, because Neville showed that inner certainty is stronger than circumstance. This is where the unseen begins to bend the scene, as he calmly replaced disappointment with fulfillment in the theater of his mind until the world conformed. This is where imagination becomes the bridge, connecting the invisible desire with tangible fact without struggle or force. This is where his nightly practice became legend, as he reviewed his day, revising every discordant moment until it matched the harmony he chose to live in. This is where discipline meets divinity, because his consistency proved that mastery of consciousness is not random. It's deliberate creation, repeated with love. This is how his students learned, not through blind belief, but through witnessing results that mirrored his method perfectly. This is where humility met power, for Neville never claimed to be special. He insisted that what worked for him works for all who dare to feel it real. This is how spiritual law replaces superstition, turning imagination into a practical instrument of transformation. This is where one story after another emerged. Debts erased, illnesses healed, relationships restored, all through the quiet act of revision. This is how Neville became both messenger and mirror, showing humanity what divine imagination looks like in action. This is where skepticism crumbles, because every success story confirmed that reality must yield to consciousness, not the other way around. This is how his life became scripture in motion, proving that belief is not passive, but creative energy shaping destiny in real time. This is where you begin to see that his teaching was not philosophy but instruction, a blueprint for reclaiming authorship of your world. This is how his legacy endures, because the same technique he lived by still transforms lives decades after his passing. This is where the line between student and teacher fades, for the power he embodied lives equally within you. And this is where realization dawns, that Neville didn't just talk about revising life, he became the living proof that imagination is the only reality. Consider the possibility that every coincidence, every unexpected meeting, every sudden opportunity in your life is not random, but a response to the revised assumptions you hold within. This is where Neville Goddard's concept of the bridge of incidents comes alive, showing that life quietly rearranges itself to reflect the inner reality you accept as true. This is where imagination becomes the unseen architect, constructing pathways that your outer world cannot resist following. This is how subtle synchronicities emerge, each one a signpost confirming that your inner revisions are already taking form in the world around you. This is where cause and effect reveal their hidden law, because every incident is the logical consequence of an invisible assumption you made and emotionally embraced. This is how transformation becomes visible, for what once seemed like chance now aligns perfectly with your revised memory and inner conviction. This is where patience meets proof, as the universe orchestrates outcomes in a sequence often unrecognizable until hindsight shows the pattern. This is where emotional alignment turns into tangible manifestation, proving Neville's insight that feeling precedes fact. This is where you begin to notice that every interaction subtly shifts to confirm your new story, guiding people, situations, and even timing to match your inner state. This is how revision ripples outward, touching multiple areas of life without effort or struggle, simply through the recalibration of consciousness. This is where the ordinary turns miraculous, because each seemingly trivial event now carries the weight of intention and design. This is how trust in the process deepens as the bridge grows steadily beneath your feet, invisible yet unshakable. This is where imagination meets reality, and every mental adjustment resonates outward, creating alignment between what you feel and what unfolds. This is how persistence shapes destiny, as each revised memory strengthens the bridge, making the outer world increasingly reflect your inner convictions. This is where the subtle art of waiting becomes your ally, because once the bridge exists in consciousness, life naturally crosses it in its own time and rhythm. This is how mastery unfolds quietly, as the world begins to orchestrate itself around your new assumptions without your forcing or pushing. This is where the unseen laws of life become undeniable, as every incident confirms that reality bends to the persistent feeling of the mind. This is where revision proves its ultimate power, showing that by changing perception, you change consequence. This is how the bridge connects now and then, inner and outer, memory and manifestation, in a continuous stream of creation. And this is where realization strikes, that every event, no matter how small, is a messenger responding faithfully to the world you have revised within. Picture for a moment that the secret to Neville Goddard's revision technique is not in words or logic, but in the emotion that you invest in each imagined scene, because feeling is the currency that compels the subconscious to act. This is where understanding deepens, as Neville taught that memory itself carries energy, and only when that energy is transformed through feeling does true revision occur. This is where the ordinary mind meets the extraordinary, because intellect alone cannot rewrite experience. The heart must participate fully. This is where sensation becomes signal. The subconscious responds to what is felt real, not what is merely thought about or analyzed. This is how the alchemy of consciousness works, converting the intensity of emotion into the substance of reality itself. This is where the power of joy, relief, love, or peace becomes more than emotion. It becomes creative force capable of reshaping the past and influencing the future. This is where you start to see why imagination alone is not enough. It must be colored with the hues of authentic feeling. This is how emotional fidelity turns theory into manifestation, because the subconscious obeys the energy behind your revision rather than the story itself. This is where subtlety becomes strength, as even small shifts in feeling can ripple through your consciousness and reorganize outer circumstances. This is where conviction is forged, because repeated emotional investment in the revised memory cements it as truth within the subconscious. This is how healing takes root, as the pain or regret once attached to a memory softens under the weight of positive, embodied feeling. This is where the difference between thinking and living your revision becomes clear, as only the latter moves mountains invisibly and inevitably. This is where resonance replaces resistance, because your emotional frequency now attracts events, people, and outcomes that mirror the reality you feel within. This is how patience transforms into certainty, for the subconscious knows to align the outer world when the inner world has fully accepted the change. This is where empowerment becomes natural, because mastery over your feelings equates to mastery over the stories you live through. This is how identity shifts, as the self who suffered transforms into the self who creates, heals, and commands reality from within. This is where subtle emotional cues begin directing outer circumstances, turning the ordinary into signs of alignment and fulfillment. This is where Neville's method shines brightest, proving that it is not imagination alone, but imagination felt that bends time, memory, and destiny. This is how mastery is measured, not by effort, but by the quiet, undeniable transformation in the texture of experience. This is where realization dawns, that the emotional key unlocks the door to the past, the future, and the infinite possibilities of the present. Ask yourself what happens when the mind clings to the familiar, when the old story insists on its permanence even as you attempt to rewrite it. For this is the subtle resistance Neville Goddard warned about. This is where inner conflict surfaces, because the ego, tied to identity and memory, resists any change that threatens its sense of control and consistency. This is where struggle appears, not because revision is impossible, but because habit and attachment create invisible chains that tug against transformation. This is how awareness sharpens, as you begin to recognize that each moment of doubt, hesitation, or fear is a signal of the old story defending itself. This is where patience becomes a tool, for resistance is a natural response that requires gentle persistence rather than force. This is where subtle rebellion is overcome, not by argument, but by feeling the new story with unwavering conviction until it displaces the old. This is how mastery is earned, because the persistent assumption of the revised memory gradually weakens the subconscious loyalty to what no longer serves you. This is where self-compassion matters, for recognizing resistance as a natural guardian allows you to revise without judgment or frustration. This is how the inner battlefield transforms into a creative workshop, as every encounter with doubt becomes an opportunity to reinforce your assumption. This is where the invisible war of consciousness is won quietly, with repetition, feeling, and unwavering focus on the desired reality. This is how clarity emerges, as you learn to distinguish between fleeting doubt and the deep knowing that anchors your revised memory. This is where patience intersects with power, because the mind cannot be rushed into belief. It must be invited and nurtured through consistent feeling. This is where subtle victories accumulate. For each time you persist despite resistance, the old story loses ground to your conscious authorship. This is how identity gradually shifts from one defined by past experiences to one defined by creative choice and inner authority. This is where discipline meets inspiration, as regular practice strengthens the bridge between imagination and reality, even when resistance whispers it cannot be. This is how Neville's wisdom manifests in practical terms, showing that mastery of life requires both awareness and emotional persistence. This is where the subconscious begins to relax, sensing that the new story is safe, valid, and inevitable. This is how transformation solidifies, for resistance fades as feeling and imagination claim their rightful power. This is where trust in the process deepens, because each internal battle is quietly resolved in favor of creation. This is where realization strikes, that every old story holds only the power you continue to give it, and once withdrawn, it dissolves before the authority of your inner revision. Envision a world where who you are is no longer defined by what happened to you, but by the stories you choose to feel as real. For this is where Neville Goddard's revision technique reshapes not only events but the self itself. This is where the old identity begins to dissolve, for each revised memory quietly removes the power of past labels, roles, and limitations. This is how transformation becomes intimate, because changing your perception of one event subtly rewires how you perceive every other aspect of your life. This is where self-concept gains fluidity, allowing the consciousness to step into a higher, more creative version of itself, without resistance or strain. This is where the inner alchemy happens, as old patterns of shame, regret, or failure are replaced with the certainty of divine authorship. This is where the subtle power of assumption becomes visible, for when you act from the revised memory, your behavior and decisions naturally reflect the new identity. This is how confidence emerges effortlessly, because you are no longer living from who you were, but from who you have assumed yourself to be. This is where continuity matters, as every daily revision, feeling, and thought compounds to solidify this new self into lived reality. This is where liberation feels tangible, because the constraints of past experiences no longer define the scope of possibility. This is how perception transforms, as you now see the world not as it was, but as it aligns with the creative identity you inhabit. This is where emotional coherence deepens, for when your inner story matches your self-image, anxiety and doubt dissolve into certainty and peace. This is where external validation becomes secondary, because your inner authority now dictates experience rather than outer approval. This is how subtle behaviors begin to shift naturally, as the new identity orchestrates decisions, reactions, and interactions effortlessly. This is where empowerment solidifies, for the act of revising the past rewires not only memory, but the sense of self that interprets the present. This is where courage grows, because the self that created the revision now confidently navigates life with imagination as its compass. This is how transformation expands outward, as the new identity radiates, affecting relationships, opportunities, and circumstances in alignment with inner truth. This is where mastery becomes holistic, because the revised self harmonizes thought, feeling, and action seamlessly. This is where Neville's teaching finds its full expression, showing that the revision of memory is inseparable from the evolution of identity. This is where freedom is truly felt, as you realize that the you who suffered, doubted, or feared no longer exists, replaced by the creative self that shapes destiny from within. And this is where the journey deepens, because with each revised memory, you step further into the reality of who you are meant to be. Can you imagine waking up each day already living in the reality you once only imagined? Because Neville Goddard's revision technique teaches that the inner world determines the outer. This is where the transformation becomes tangible, for the revised memory is not meant to remain a thought. It is meant to be lived as if it had always been true. This is where behavior aligns effortlessly with imagination, because when you feel your inner story as real, your actions naturally follow the script of that new reality. This is how life begins to mirror consciousness, as circumstances shift to reflect the state of being you inhabit within. This is where the ordinary dissolves, and each day becomes a stage upon which your chosen identity plays out with authenticity and ease. This is where habitual reactions lose power, because living from the revised story replaces reflexive fear or regret with intentional creativity and presence. This is where emotional resonance guides choices, for the feelings anchored in your revised memory dictate the quality and outcome of interactions and decisions. This is how outer life becomes a reflection of inner conviction, proving Neville's insight that the world responds to your inner state rather than the other way around. This is where timing aligns, as doors open, conversations unfold, and opportunities present themselves in perfect synchronicity with the life you are now living internally. This is where effortless manifestation becomes possible, because the subconscious mind no longer struggles with contradiction. It simply expresses what you already are feeling. This is how self-trust strengthens, as each day lived from the revision confirms the reliability of imagination as the creative force behind experience. This is where courage expands, for living from the new story removes hesitation and anchors you in the certainty of possibility. This is how relationships transform, because others respond naturally to the energy and confidence projected by the revised self. This is where synchronicity accelerates as the bridge of incidents grows stronger, connecting inner states with outer occurrences in seamless flow. This is where consistency becomes habit, and habit becomes second nature, solidifying the revision into lived reality. This is where the feeling of the wish fulfilled is no longer abstract, but a living, breathing state that colors perception, decision-making, and opportunity. This is how empowerment feels complete, as you realize that to live from the revision is to act from mastery, not reaction. This is where identity, behavior, and circumstances converge, creating harmony between inner conviction and outer reality. This is how Neville's teaching proves itself again. Reality shifts not because you manipulate events, but because you inhabit the state they must mirror. This is where the journey accelerates, because the moment you live from the revised story, creation itself conspires to support your inner vision. Now consider this, the power of one small revision rippling outward to touch every corner of your life. For Neville Goddard's technique does not alter events in isolation, it reshapes entire patterns. This is where the domino effect begins, because when one memory is rewritten with feeling, it subtly shifts all related experiences, decisions, and perceptions in alignment with the new assumption. This is where the unseen architecture of life bends, as one corrected scene quietly rearranges others that were linked to it through belief and emotion. This is how transformation compounds, with each revision acting as a catalyst that triggers a cascade of change across relationships, opportunities, and personal growth. This is where cause and effect reveal their hidden flow, showing that inner change is the primary driver of outer events. This is where freedom expands, because altering one memory releases old energies that had held multiple areas of life hostage, allowing new possibilities to emerge naturally. This is how momentum builds, as each small success reinforces the subconscious, making future revisions easier, more automatic, and more potent. This is where empowerment multiplies, because mastery over one aspect of your inner world radiates outward, creating influence over everything connected to it. This is where subtle synchronicities emerge, proof that the universe responds organically to your revised state rather than arbitrary effort. This is how the web of life aligns, as unseen threads weave a reality that mirrors your inner assumption in increasingly intricate ways. This is where habits are transformed, because repeated emotional investment in the revision rewires your subconscious and changes automatic responses to life's challenges. This is where emotional resilience grows, as each domino toppled clears space for greater confidence, clarity, and presence. This is how external circumstances converge, showing that reality is not fixed but fluid, bending to the consistent state of consciousness you maintain. This is where relationships evolve, because people respond to the energy of your inner alignment rather than the memory of past discord. This is how opportunity unfolds, as the world seems to conspire to match the coherence of your inner story with external reality. This is where patience meets faith, because the dominoes move in their own sequence, yet inevitably in harmony with your revised assumptions. This is how revision multiplies, for each corrected memory triggers further internal shifts that ripple outward, creating exponential change. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, as your life begins to reflect the holistic impact of consistent imagination practiced with feeling. This is how mastery manifests, showing that the smallest intentional change within can transform the vast tapestry of life itself. And this is where realization dawns, that your revisions are not isolated acts, but catalysts capable of reshaping every aspect of existence in alignment with your inner vision. Picture for a moment that every grievance, every hurt, every lingering resentment is not fixed in stone, but a scene waiting for the brush of your imagination. Because Neville Goddard's revision technique transforms forgiveness into a creative act. This is where the healing begins, as you realize that by revising memories of conflict, betrayal, or pain, you are not denying reality. You are transmuting its emotional charge into liberation and peace. This is where compassion takes form, because imagining a different, harmonious outcome allows both yourself and others to exist free of the weight of past mistakes or misunderstandings. This is how forgiveness becomes tangible, for the subconscious accepts the new narrative as real and begins to adjust behavior, perception, and feeling accordingly. This is where love replaces judgment, as the act of revision softens resentment and replaces it with empathy, understanding, and grace. This is how empowerment blooms, because freeing yourself from old emotional attachments puts the creative authority back in your hands rather than leaving it in the past. This is where cycles of negativity dissolve, as revising one painful memory quietly prevents it from triggering fear, anger, or self-doubt in the present and future. This is where emotional freedom becomes real, because no one can hold power over you once the memory has been transformed through imaginative feeling. This is how relationships shift, because your new state radiates outward, inviting reconciliation, understanding, and alignment with others. This is where inner peace deepens, for you are no longer reacting to old energy but creating new emotional and experiential patterns that feel lighter and expansive. This is how love becomes a practical tool, demonstrating that imagination can restore not only your own sense of wholeness, but also the unseen harmony around you. This is where the power of the heart reveals itself, showing that forgiveness is both the key to self-liberation and the bridge to restoring the flow of life around you. This is how Neville's wisdom unfolds, teaching that no external apology or event is required. The act of inner revision alone rewrites the reality of the experience. This is where responsibility meets grace, because the choice to forgive through imagination restores agency over both memory and present experience. This is how subtle energy aligns, as the vibrational shift of forgiveness attracts circumstances, people, and outcomes that confirm your inner transformation. This is where cycles of pain end, as the act of revision prevents the old story from echoing into the future and creating repeated suffering. This is how mastery over self becomes mastery over life, because the mind that forgives imagines freely, creating space for new experiences, joy, and connection. This is where liberation feels palpable, as emotional weight is lifted and replaced with the vibrant energy of creative consciousness. This is how the past becomes a tool, rather than a chain, shaping not limitation but new potential through the power of imagination. This is where realization strikes, that to forgive through revision is to reclaim your own life, to turn every memory of pain into a stepping stone toward freedom, wholeness, and conscious creation. Envision a moment when you realize that the true creator of your life is not the conscious mind, but the subconscious, and that Neville Goddard's revision technique is the key to directing this invisible architect. This is where the mechanics of creation become clear, because the subconscious faithfully manifests whatever is impressed upon it with feeling, without judgment or delay. This is where imagination becomes instruction, for each revised memory is a command implanted directly into the subconscious, guiding reality to conform to it. This is how mastery is amplified, because while the conscious mind may wander, the subconscious quietly carries out the blueprint of your inner assumptions. This is where alignment occurs, as the emotional intensity of your revision ensures that the subconscious accepts it as fact and begins orchestrating events accordingly. This is where subtle control replaces struggle, for you no longer attempt to force outcomes outwardly. You set the inner state and allow the subconscious to execute it. This is how consistency reinforces power, because repeated nightly revisions anchor the desired reality deep within the subconscious circuitry of your mind. This is where life begins to reflect inner authority, as relationships, opportunities, and circumstances naturally conform to the new story you have impressed upon your inner world. This is how the ordinary becomes miraculous, for what seems external is merely a mirror of the states you maintain within. This is where trust deepens, because the subconscious never forgets or questions. It simply manifests with absolute fidelity to the impressions you provide. This is how patience transforms, as you learn that subtle, consistent input into the subconscious produces lasting, exponential change over time. This is where alignment between desire and reality is perfected, because the inner world becomes the unquestioned blueprint for outer experience. This is how the power of revision becomes visible, as the subconscious translates imagined emotion into tangible events, opportunities, and synchronicities. This is where mastery feels natural, because you recognize that the mind, not circumstances, dictates reality. This is where awareness expands, showing that every feeling, thought, and imagined scene is a lever capable of moving the entire framework of your life. This is how creation becomes effortless, as the subconscious faithfully executes the commands it has received through feeling and assumption. This is where Neville's teaching reaches its pinnacle, illustrating that conscious effort is unnecessary once the subconscious is rightly impressed. This is how dreams become fact, because the inner state precedes and guarantees outer manifestation. This is where the quiet power of revision asserts itself. For every memory reshaped is a command executed with precision by the subconscious. This is where realization strikes, that the subconscious is the true architect, and Neville's technique is the blueprint for consciously directing its infinite creative power. Think of the moment when you realize that imagination is not reserved for fantasies or daydreams, but is the constant, active force shaping every experience. Because Neville Goddard's revision technique teaches you to harness it consciously. This is where the mundane becomes sacred. For every thought you entertain and every scene you replay carries the potential to alter your reality subtly or profoundly. This is where your day-to-day awareness transforms, as you begin to notice that revising even minor memories can influence your present mood, decisions, and interactions. This is how ordinary moments become opportunities for creation, because each mental rehearsal, each felt revision, plants seeds for external manifestation. This is where the bridge between imagination and reality becomes undeniable, as the subconscious begins to align outer circumstances with the states you cultivate internally. This is how awareness sharpens, for you start catching habitual reactions and replacing them with intentional, imaginative reinterpretations that feel real and satisfying. This is where empowerment grows, because the realization dawns that you do not passively respond to life. You actively script it in the privacy of your consciousness. This is how subtle adjustments multiply. For revising a conversation, a disappointment, or a fear strengthens your capacity to shape the course of the day effortlessly. This is where emotional intelligence becomes creation, because feeling the new version of any event teaches your subconscious to act in harmony with your chosen reality. This is how synchronicities appear, as life begins to deliver situations and people that correspond perfectly to your inner state. This is where habits of thought evolve, turning imaginative practice into a daily tool for manifestation and personal growth. This is where persistence pays off, because repeated engagement with imagination trains your mind to assume the desired state as naturally as breathing. This is how resilience develops, for every revised memory reduces emotional reactivity and reinforces inner stability, even in challenging circumstances. This is where creativity infuses life, because the act of imaginative revision reminds you that reality is pliable and responsive to conscious choice. This is how your perception expands, revealing patterns, possibilities, and connections previously hidden by habitual thinking and unexamined memories. This is where the rhythm of creation integrates into daily routines, making intentional imagination as natural as any other skill. This is how the inner life and outer life synchronize, producing harmony, opportunity, and effortless alignment with your desires. This is where Neville's insight becomes practical, demonstrating that imagination is not an occasional exercise but the continuous engine of reality formation. This is how mastery is maintained, by living consciously in alignment with inner revisions, allowing your subconscious to translate them seamlessly into experience. This is where realization strikes, that daily, mindful imagination is the ongoing practice that transforms ordinary life into a deliberate creation of your highest vision. Ask yourself, what happens when doubt creeps in? When the mind questions whether Neville Goddard's revision technique truly works, for skepticism is the subtle barrier every practitioner must face. This is where the inner dialogue matters, because hesitation weakens the emotional conviction necessary for the subconscious to accept the revised memory as real. This is where persistence becomes power, as repeated, feeling-driven imagination gradually overwhelms doubt with experiential evidence. This is how subtle proof emerges, when small coincidences, shifts in behavior, or unexpected resolutions confirm that your inner revision is manifesting in the outer world. This is where trust deepens, for the subconscious does not argue. It simply delivers results when given consistent, emotionally charged input. This is where patience becomes a tool, because even when evidence is not immediately visible, the revision is quietly restructuring reality behind the scenes. This is how inner certainty grows, as repeated practice teaches the mind that imagination, when felt as real, is infallibly creative. This is where clarity replaces fear, showing that doubt is only temporary resistance, dissolvable by the sustained feeling of the fulfilled scene. This is how faith is proven, not by blind belief, but through the tangible unfolding of revised events in life circumstances. This is where mastery begins. For every time you act despite skepticism, you reinforce the subconscious's obedience to your inner state. This is where emotional resilience strengthens, because you learn to hold the feeling of reality even when the outer world temporarily contradicts it. This is how alignment becomes effortless, as doubt diminishes and your inner story increasingly governs outer experiences. This is where subtle victories accumulate, creating a body of evidence that cannot be denied, reinforcing your confidence in the technique. This is how perseverance transforms into effortless practice, because you witness the law of assumption operating consistently and faithfully. This is where the inner narrative consolidates, as doubt is replaced with lived experience of imagination translating into fact. This is how trust in your own creative power is cemented, proving that revision works even when logic resists it. This is where external life begins to mirror inner certainty, confirming that reality bends to sustained imagination and feeling. This is how the mind harmonizes with the law, allowing you to act from conviction rather than question or hesitation. This is where Neville's wisdom comes alive, showing that skepticism is simply the last obstacle before full creative authority is claimed. This is where realization strikes, that holding steady in your revised assumption, despite doubt, is the essential key to manifesting mastery over your life. Consider the possibility that Neville Goddard's revision technique is not a one-time exercise, but a lifestyle, a daily practice that seamlessly integrates into every thought, emotion, and action. This is where mastery becomes habitual, as consistent revision trains the mind to automatically reinterpret events in ways that serve your highest vision. This is where the ordinary transforms into the extraordinary, because every memory you touch with imagination and feeling begins to ripple outward into external reality. This is how your consciousness becomes the director of experience, subtly orchestrating circumstances, relationships, and opportunities in alignment with the revised story. This is where effortless creation emerges, as inner alignment naturally produces outer results without struggle, manipulation, or force. This is where emotional awareness becomes your guide, helping you identify which memories need attention and which revisions will most profoundly impact your present and future. This is how resilience deepens, because the practice of revision softens the emotional weight of past events, making it easier to respond rather than react to life. This is where synchronicity accelerates, as repeated revisions align the unseen threads of life, drawing events and people into harmony with your inner state. This is how identity consolidates, for each act of revision strengthens the self that imagines, feels, and commands reality from within. This is where consistency cultivates trust, proving to both mind and heart that imagination exercised with feeling inevitably shapes experience. This is how your inner world becomes a living laboratory, where observation, revision, and feeling merge to produce tangible transformation. This is where patience meets action, as daily practice ensures that the subconscious is continually impressed with the reality you wish to embody. This is how the subtle becomes powerful, as even small adjustments in perception accumulate into large-scale changes in circumstances and self-concept. This is where freedom becomes lived, for revising memories liberates you from the constraints of past events and habitual patterns of thought. This is how alignment manifests effortlessly, because the inner revision directs attention, energy, and expectation toward your chosen reality. This is where imagination acts as both map and compass, guiding you through life's unfolding with precision and clarity. This is how mastery integrates seamlessly, transforming revision from an exercise into a natural expression of conscious living. This is where outer reality harmonizes with inner truth, confirming the potency of your imagination and feeling. This is how Neville's teaching becomes a daily lived experience, proving that reality responds faithfully to the state of consciousness maintained within. This is where realization strikes, that the continual practice of revision is not just a technique, but the very art of living as the conscious creator of your life. Envision a world where every memory, every thought, every feeling is a doorway to infinite possibilities. Because Neville Goddard's revision technique ultimately reveals that consciousness alone shapes reality. This is where the culmination of all practice becomes evident, as each revised memory, each felt assumption, accumulates into a life consciously authored from within. This is where mastery transcends method. Because the technique is no longer a tool, it becomes the natural rhythm of creation, flowing effortlessly through every moment of awareness. This is how imagination reveals its infinite scope, showing that reality is pliable, responsive, and limited only by the depth of feeling and conviction you bring to your inner world. This is where freedom is absolute. For every obstacle, regret, or limitation dissolves when the subconscious fully accepts the revised state as true. This is how synchronicity and serendipity become constant companions, as life arranges itself around the vibration of your inner revisions without effort or force. This is where the ordinary becomes miraculous, because what once seemed impossible now manifests naturally as a reflection of your inner mastery. This is how personal power expands, revealing that you are not a passive observer, but an active participant, and ultimately the architect of your lived experience. This is where trust deepens, because repeated evidence of revision working removes doubt, leaving only certainty that imagination and feeling shape outcomes. This is how identity reaches its pinnacle, as the self that imagines, feels, and assumes fully embodies the creative authority to craft reality at will. This is where emotional coherence becomes effortless, because the inner state harmonizes thought, feeling, and perception into a unified command for life to follow. This is how mastery over past, present, and future merges, showing that time itself bends to consciousness when inner revision is applied with persistence and feeling. This is where subtle energy becomes visible in experience. As outer events, relationships, and circumstances align seamlessly with the inner vision held steady in consciousness. This is how empowerment is eternal, because once the mechanism of revision is understood and embodied, the ability to reshape reality never fades. This is where limitations vanish, as every assumption, once deeply felt, commands the universe to rearrange itself in accordance with inner truth. This is how the infinite possibilities of life are unlocked, revealing that every what-if is already a doorway waiting for the consciousness bold enough to step through. This is where creativity becomes sovereignty, because the mind that revises consciously becomes the ruler of its own existence. This is how life becomes art, with each revised memory and each assumed state acting as brushstrokes on the infinite canvas of reality. This is where Neville's wisdom reaches its apex, proving that conscious revision is the ultimate tool to align inner vision with outer manifestation. This is where realization dawns fully, that reality is not something that happens to you, but something you continuously create, refine, and expand through the infinite power of imagination and feeling.